In the silence of a world 200,000 miles from home, a human being placed his boot onto ground that had never been touched, and said something that every person alive would remember for the rest of their lives. That moment cost a decade of effort, the lives of those who did not survive to see it, and the full force of a civilization in competition with itself. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
A mission that was not just about science, not just about national pride, but about something much harder to name, the human need to go beyond what has ever been done before. Tonight we turn to the event that changed how our species understood its own possibilities, a mission that carried 3 men into the void and returned them with something the whole Earth would share. The question tonight is not simply what happened, but what it meant, and why it still matters.
In July of 1969, 3 men climbed into a spacecraft on top of the most powerful rocket ever built, and 8 days later 2 of them walked on the moon while 600 million people watched from Earth.
We are speaking about Apollo 11,
the first crewed mission to land on the moon, a triumph of engineering, courage, and collective will that remains the furthest any human being has ever traveled from the surface of the Earth.
Then let us begin with the world that made this mission not only possible, but necessary.
To understand Apollo 11, you have to understand the Cold War, the most defining geopolitical tension of the 20th century. After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the 2 dominant powers on Earth, each with nuclear weapons, each with a competing vision of how civilization should be organized. They could not fight each other directly without risking annihilation, so they competed in other arenas, and one of the most visible of those arenas was space.
So space became a theater of competition between 2 systems.
Exact. And the Soviet Union moved first. In October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It was a small metal sphere, barely the size of a beach ball, broadcasting a simple radio signal. But its symbolic impact in the United States was enormous. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, the same technology could, in theory, deliver a nuclear weapon anywhere on Earth. The beeping sound of Sputnik was heard as a warning.
So the shock was not scientific, it was strategic.
Yes, and the shocks kept coming. In April of 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space, completing 1 orbit of the Earth and returning safely. The United States had been beaten again, and this time there was no technical ambiguity. A human being had left the Earth. The Soviets had done it first.
So the United States needed a response that could not be answered.
Exactly, and it came from the young President John F. Kennedy. In May of 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and declared that the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade. At that moment, the United States had sent exactly 1 astronaut into space for a flight of 15 minutes. The technology required to reach the moon did not yet exist.
So Kennedy committed to achieving something that was technically impossible at the time he said it.
Yes. And that is precisely what made it powerful. Kennedy understood that only an audacious goal could mobilize the resources, the talent, and the public will necessary to beat the Soviets in space. At its peak, the Apollo program employed more than 400,000 people, engineers, scientists, technicians, machinists, and support staff, working across every major American university and industrial center.
So this was not only a scientific undertaking, it was a national mobilization.
Exact. Apollo was simultaneously science, engineering, politics, and propaganda, all fused into a single machine pointed at the moon, and the machine at the center of it was unlike anything the world had seen before.
The Saturn V.
Yes, the Saturn V rocket remains to this day the most powerful machine ever successfully operated by human beings. It stood 111 meters tall, roughly the height of a 36-story building. It weighed nearly 3,000 tons fully fueled. Its 5 first-stage engines burned through 20 tons of fuel every second, producing a thrust equivalent to the combined output of 85 Hoover dams.
So, the rocket itself was already an almost unimaginable object.
Yes, and on top of that rocket sat a relatively small set of spacecraft. Think of it this way. Imagine the entire Saturn V as a very large, very expensive delivery vehicle. The rocket's job was simply to get the spacecraft away from Earth's gravity and pointed toward the moon. At the top of the rocket were 2 key vessels. The command module, named Columbia, was where all 3 astronauts would live for most of the journey, a cone-shaped capsule roughly the interior size of a small car. Attached to Columbia was the lunar module, named Eagle, a fragile, angular vehicle designed for one purpose only: to descend from lunar orbit, land on the moon, and return two astronauts to orbit.
So, the plan required separating and rejoining in space, around the moon, with no margin for error.
Yes. The mission architecture was extraordinarily complex. After launch, the spacecraft would travel for approximately 3 days to reach the moon. Then Columbia and Eagle together would enter lunar orbit. 2 astronauts would transfer into Eagle and descend to the surface. The third astronaut would remain in Columbia, orbiting alone, waiting alone. After the surface activities, Eagle's upper stage would lift off from the moon, rendezvous with Columbia in orbit, and the crew would transfer back before beginning the 3-day journey home.
So every step depended on the one before it succeeding perfectly.
Exactly. And the people who would execute this sequence had trained for years to be ready. Neil Armstrong, the mission commander, was 38 years old in 1969. He had been a naval aviator and test pilot before joining NASA. A man with exceptional situational awareness and an almost preternatural calm under pressure. Those who worked with him described him as deeply private, precise in everything he said, and wholly focused on the task.
So the right person for a mission, where composure would determine survival.
Yes, Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, was a different kind of intellect. He held a doctorate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Astronautics. His thesis had been on orbital rendezvous mechanics, the precise mathematical problem that Apollo depended on all. He was technically brilliant, competitive, and more emotionally candid than most astronauts of his era, a quality that would serve him well in the difficult years after the mission.
And the third crew member, Michael Collins, orbited alone while the other 2 landed.
Yes, Collins was the command module pilot, and his role was in some ways the most psychologically demanding of all. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the moon, Collins orbited above, completely alone, out of radio contact with Earth for 48 minutes during each orbit as he passed behind the moon. At those moments he was the most isolated human being in history, further from any other person than any person had ever been done.
So he carried an impossible weight, the knowledge that if Eagle did not return, he would go home alone.
Yes, and mission planners had understood this. There was no rescue possible. If the Eagle could not lift off from the moon, Collins would leave without them. Collins later wrote that he felt not fear in those hours, but something more like solitude. A strange complete solitude that he found in some ways peaceful. He was someone who had trained to master his own mind, and in that silent orbit, the training held him.
So all 3 men brought something essential that the mission could not have survived without.
Yes. And on the morning of July the 16th, 1969, they climbed to the top of the Saturn V and waited. 1 million people had traveled to the Florida coast to watch the launch. Hundreds of millions more watched on television screens around the world. At 9:32 in the morning, the Saturn V ignited. Those who were there described it not simply as a sound but as a physical force, a wave of pressure that struck the chest and the ground simultaneously, followed by a light so bright that people shielded their eyes even from miles away.
So the launch itself was an overwhelming physical event.
Yes, the rocket rose slowly at first, almost impossibly slowly given its violence, then accelerated until it was beyond sight in under 3 minutes. The journey to the moon took 3 days. The crew performed systems checks, slept in short intervals, and looked out at a universe that very few human eyes had ever seen. On July the 19th, they entered lunar orbit. The moon filled the windows of Columbia.
So the next day was the landing.
Yes. On July the 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the Eagle and began their descent. And almost immediately, things began to go wrong. The onboard guidance computer began issuing error codes. Alarms that had never appeared in training, numbered 1202 and 1201. In mission control in Houston, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Steve Bales had seconds to decide whether to abort or continue. The alarms meant the computer was overloaded, receiving more data than it could process. But it was designed to prioritize the most critical tasks and discard the rest. Bales called continue. The descent went on.
So the landing nearly ended before it began.
Yes, and then the terrain became the problem. The computer was guiding the Eagle toward a crater field scattered with boulders, none of which had been visible from orbit. Armstrong took manual control and flew the Eagle horizontally, scanning the surface for a safe flat spot. The fuel was running low. Mission control called out 30 seconds of fuel remaining. If the fuel ran out before they landed, the Eagle would fall. There was no recovery from that.
So Armstrong was flying by hand, with seconds of fuel left, looking for a place to land on a world no human had ever touched.
Yes. He found a clear area just ahead and brought the Eagle down. The contact light illuminated. The engine shut down. Dust that had not moved in 4 billion years drifted slowly in the vacuum. Armstrong spoke 4 words to Mission Control. The Eagle has landed.
So those 4 words ended a decade of work and several billion years of waiting.
Yes, in Mission Control, the flight director Charlie Duke could barely speak. He replied, "You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We are breathing again." Several hours later, in the early hours of July the 21st, Armstrong descended the ladder of the Eagle and stepped onto the surface of the moon. He said, "That is one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind."
So 600 million people heard those words at the same moment.
Yes, 600 million people, roughly 1/5 of all humanity at the time, watched or listened as that moment occurred. It was one of the first truly global shared experiences in human history, made possible by the same television satellite technology that the space program had helped develop. People gathered around television sets in living rooms, in public squares, in hospital waiting rooms, in bars and embassies, and schools across every continent.
So the moon landing was not only an American event, it was a human one.
Yes. The plaque left on the moon read, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. We came in peace for all mankind." Armstrong and Aldrin spent approximately 2.5 hours on the surface, collecting rock samples, planting a flag, and setting up scientific instruments. Both men later described the experience of standing on the moon as something that resisted ordinary language.
So even the people who were there struggled to say what it felt like.
Yes. Aldrin described the view as magnificent desolation. 2 words that seemed to cancel each other until you understand what he meant. The moon was utterly silent, utterly still, utterly empty. No wind, no sound, no life of any kind. The sky was black even in full sunlight, because there was no atmosphere to scatter the light. And hanging in that black sky, at a distance of 240,000 miles, was the Earth small enough to cover with a thumb, brilliantly blue, the only color in the universe visible to their eyes.
So from the moon, the whole of human history was visible as a single small object.
Yes, every person who had ever lived, every war ever fought, every love ever known, every city ever built, all of it contained in something you could hide behind your thumb. Armstrong later said that he had not expected that image to affect him as deeply as it did. Collins, orbiting above, had a similar experience. He wrote that he was too busy to feel lonely, but that when he looked at the Earth from his window, he felt something he could only describe as a sense of fragility, as though the Earth was something that needed protecting and denied.
So leaving Earth was what made them understand how much it mattered.
Yes, and this may be the most lasting philosophical gift of the Apollo program. Eagle lifted off from the moon on July the 21st. The ascent engine fired precisely as designed, carrying Armstrong and Aldrin up to rendezvous with Collins in orbit. The 3 crew members reunited in Columbia, jettisoned the Eagle, and began the 3-day journey back to Earth. On July the 24th, Columbia entered the Earth's atmosphere at nearly 40,000 kilometers per hour. The heat shield glowed at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees.
So the last danger came at the very end, returning home.
Yes. If the heat shield had failed, the capsule would have burned. It held. The parachutes deployed. Columbia splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 8 days, 3 hours and 18 minutes after launcher. The crew was recovered by the USS Hornet, placed immediately into quarantine, and greeted by President Nixon through a glass window.
So even after arriving home safely, they could not yet touch the world they had returned to.
Yes. Scientists were uncertain whether the moon might harbor microorganisms that could pose a risk to life on Earth. The quarantine lasted 21 days. No contamination was found, but the caution speaks to the seriousness with which every aspect of the mission had been considered. These were people who understood, in a way few others have, that going beyond the known requires accepting risks that cannot be fully calculated.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret. For those who want to understand the full human story behind Apollo 11, where would you invite them to continue with?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with A Man on the Moon by Andrew Chaikin.
So this covers the broader Apollo program, not only the single mission.
It is a definitive and deeply human account of the Apollo missions, combining technical detail with personal stories from the astronauts who made history. Chaikin interviewed every surviving Apollo astronaut. And the result is a book that makes you feel the weight of what they carried, not only in the spacecraft, but in their minds.
Is it accessible to someone with no background in engineering or space science?
Entirely. Chaikin is a master at translating technical complexity into human experience. You do not need to understand rocketry to feel what it meant to sit on top of a Saturn V and wait for the ignition.
So reading it gives you the mission from the inside, through the people who lived it.
Precisely. And that is the only place where the full meaning of Apollo can actually be found.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of Apollo 11 was the completion of Kennedy's challenge, a geopolitical victory of enormous symbolic force. The Soviet Union had raced to reach the moon first and failed. Their program had suffered a catastrophic loss when their own moon rocket, the N-1, exploded on the launch pad months before Apollo 11 flew. The United States had won the space race, and with it a powerful argument about which system could mobilize human ingenuity at the highest level.
So the moon landing was a political conclusion, as much as a scientific one.
Yes, but its scientific legacy was also real and enduring. The rock samples returned by Apollo 11 and subsequent missions fundamentally changed our understanding of how the moon formed, confirming the giant impact hypothesis, that the moon was created when a large body struck the early Earth roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The technological developments generated by Apollo produced advances in computing, materials science, telecommunications, and medical monitoring that are embedded in everyday life today.
So the mission changed not only what we knew, but the tools we had to learn more.
Exact. And yet some of the most important critiques of Apollo are also worth hearing. The program cost approximately $25 billion in 1960s. Money, resources spent at a moment when significant portions of American society were living in poverty. The civil rights movement was at its height. The Vietnam War was consuming lives and treasure. Some argued, not unreasonably, that the moon could wait and the suffering on Earth could not.
So the triumph was not uncontested, even at the time.
No, and this tension has never fully resolved. What Apollo 11 did achieve without question is a transformation in how the human species understands itself. Before July of 1969, the moon was something humanity could only look at. After that date, it was somewhere humanity had been.
So the horizon itself changed.
Yes, and that change in the horizon is not reversible. Today, as new missions to the moon and Mars are being planned, and in some cases already underway, the question Apollo 11 answered is still the one that drives them. Not can we go, that has been answered, but what kind of species do we choose to be? Apollo 11 was not just about reaching the moon. It was about proving that humanity could achieve what once seemed impossible. And the moon landing did not just change science. It changed how we see ourselves.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the 8 days that changed where our species thought it could go.
3 people sat on top of the most powerful machine ever built and trusted that the work of 400,000 others had been done correctly. That trust and that achievement remain among the finest things our species has produced.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.